All right. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn today. I want to thank our guest, Justin Noble, for joining us today, and want to mention that just a little quick information about Justin. He writes for the Science and Environmental for writes on science and environmental issues for U.S. magazines, investigative sites, and literary journals. He has been published in Best American Science and Nature Writing and Best American Travel Writing. His 2020 Rolling Stone magazine story, America's Radioactive Secret, won an award for the National Association of Science Writers and inspired this book we're going to talk about today. And Justin's work has helped lead to lawsuits, public dialogue, academic research, and has been taught at Harvard's School of Public Health. So I want to thank Justin for joining us today. We're going to be talking about his new book that's coming out, and we're going to go over some really important topics. So thank you for those who are joining us, and thank you, Justin, for joining us today.
Thank you, Jillian and Emily and Protect PT. I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for coming in. I'm trying to give folks in the Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia area, especially a little bit of an idea of what the book contains. Some of you may have been following the work for some time, others may be new to it. But essentially, as Jillian mentioned, I am a science and environmental journalist. I've spent years working and reporting on all sorts of topics. For the past 10 years or so, it's mostly been work on issues connected to oil and gas development. And for the past 6 or 7 years, I've focused in on this topic of oil field radioactivity. That is the radioactivity brought to the surface in oil and gas development and the many different pathways of contamination that pose harm to the industry's workers, the public, and the environment, and communities in oil and gas country. And I think that may seem like a kind of far-flung topic, like something a little bit esoteric, but actually, when you dial in on it, it really takes you right to the heart of this industry and some of the problems that have been occurring since day one that in many cases, very few people have paid attention to. But now we are paying attention, and it's really I think it's the most important way to hold this industry accountable. I just heard the other day of a lawsuit, regular lawsuits against oil and gas involving climate change issues, and these are important and appropriate. But sometimes they can really seem legally like reaches, and they've had difficult holding up in court. This issue is very different. People who have litigated on this issue have often had successes, and that's because the harms and the pathways of contamination are really, once you understand the science, visible and easy to see. And the industry's ways of trying to solve these problems have really been utter failures and put people at risk every step of the way. So yeah, the book is out April 24th. There's some really fun events that are being set up all across the Marcellus Utica area. And I'll have a list up soon, but there's events at museums, there's events at libraries, events with music. It's going to really be, it's going to be a good time. And of course, you'll have the book. So I will get into it. And yeah, if we can go to the next slide then. QR code. That's it. That takes you to a way. I didn't know that was its own slide, but that's fine. That takes you to a right to pre-order. It takes you right to a link where you can find a bunch of pre-order links. So yeah, you can pre-order the book now, even though it's not out till April 24th. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so always try and ease into this topic and just refocus people's minds to understand it. But this is a quote from a really great nuclear forensic scientist. We think of oil and gas in a lot of different ways, but this is another way of looking at it. Essentially, what you're doing is taking an underground radioactive reservoir and bringing it up to the biosphere where it can interact with people in the environment. And in essence, this is really just trying to bring it down to an easy to understand level and make us realize that this isn't this extraordinary reach that oil field waste and is radioactive. You're pulling things up from the earth in a manner where it becomes quite really obvious that you're going to have issues with what you're pulling up. Oil and gas happens to pull up some of the most interesting radioactive elements in the earth. We can go to the next slide. And
Yeah, I'm not sure if Emily heard you, that we want to. Oh, thanks, Sorry, thank you. A little technical glitch there. Go
I
ahead,
don't know. Sure.
Justin.
And it's good. Yeah, well, I was going to say it's good to hang out with Marco. Marco's someone who's also really helped a lot of communities analyze samples and been an important part of this ecosystem. So, okay, simple graphic. I've shown this for years, but this really conveys a lot about oil and gas development. On the left, we have a conventional well. On the right, we have a fracked well. The first thing to notice is that the fracked well is going down to a layer, a geologic layer called a black shale. So I'm just going to give a quick lesson in petroleum geology. Most of the oil and gas that is being harnessed on Earth comes from geologic layers called black shales. Black shales form on the bottom of shallow marine environments. So imagine the Gulf of Mexico today. You have rivers bringing sediments in from the land into the shallow sea, and you also have a lot of marine life, particularly small marine life like algae. Dead organic material falls to the bottom of the sea. It accumulates as this rich, silty, mucky layer on the bottom, and over time and under pressure, that will form this geologic layer called the black shale. It's rich in organic material, and that will become your future oil and gas. What happens over millions of years is oil and gas will seep out of that layer, and it will try and make its way through channels to areas of less pressure in the earth. So it's going up because up is less pressure than down, and it will collect against impermeable layers, against layers where it cannot pass through and form essentially a bubble of fuel underground. And you drill into those layers, and oil can rush out at the surface. It fountains out, like you imagine, movies about old West Texas, and the gas can rush out in a roar. And that's the oil and gas that's been much easier to harness. Now what we're doing is we are drilling into the mother lode, into the black shale layer. It's been stuck too tight there to access, but the techniques of, I'll call it modern fracking, even though they're not modern in the progressive sense of the word, but these really invasive and industrial techniques have enabled us to access that shale. But one early problem comes with this process, which is that black shales have long been known to have a elevated radioactivity content. They're elevated in uranium and thorium. This is actually one of the ways that drillers find the best locations to drill in the Marcellus. They look for areas that return a high radioactivity reading. And so you picture a problem because you drill down to the shale, and now there's this new innovation of drilling horizontally through the shale. But that means all of that area that you've drilled out, as you drill a horizontal well, you're drilling a hole, right? So all the stuff you pull out of the hole, which is really just dirt and rock, but it happens to be dirt and rock that can have an elevated radioactivity level. And this is one of many waste problems for the industry. This is relatively new to fracking. Drilling the vertical wells, they didn't really have to deal with radioactive drill cuttings, but this is a new problem. And this is a big problem for areas in the Marcellus Utica, because this becomes a landfill problem. Where do you take all this extraordinary amount of waste? But there are other waste streams even before we get to that. And I'll start with the first one on the list, which is brine, and we can go to the next slide. So, right, can't bring oil and gas to the surface without also bringing brine to the surface. Brine is the name the industry has given this waste stream. It's really just water that is mixed in with the formation, but it happens to have an extraordinarily high salt content. It can also be elevated in various heavy metals, including the radioactive metal radium. And this really becomes the core problem of the industry. Many wells produce more brine than they do oil and gas. You go to a wellhead, you look at the tanks. If there is oil being produced, one will say oil or more, and some will also say brine. And this, in the east at least, in the Marcellus and Utica, this brine will be picked up at the wellhead in trucks that look just like this. They're not appropriately designed to carry brine. These are often, they look like septic trucks, and in some cases they are septic trucks that have been repurposed for this purpose. But they're not designed to carry a hazardous industrial product, which is what brine is. And this is just to give you an idea of how much, and I'll show you another graphic in just a moment. We can go to the next slide. And here we have some lovely history. And this is really something that I try and do in the book, because I think this is really important for people holding these projects accountable. A critique is going to often be that we are drawing this stuff from a very shallow well, that we're mad about some sort of infrastructure. But no, the problems with the oil fields waste stream goes back decades. And even the industry or the regulator's own voice are often some of the most effective at conveying this problem. So this is coming from Michigan. You see the date circled there, 1953. And the Michigan Geological Survey Division, so it's a part of the state, and they're really better than anyone I've seen recently, laying out exactly what is wrong with brine. I'm just going to read the lower quote, the lower two quotes. Brine waters are highly concentrated solutions of salt and other minerals, which, when undiluted, can do severe damage to animal, aquatic, and vegetable life and freshwater supplies. So even at this point in time, they were just focused on the salt, and brine was a problem. When they say other minerals, we now know that to be heavy metals and radioactive heavy metals. That wasn't really a focus in the 50s, but brine still they knew was problematic, strictly from the salt perspective. And then they go on to describe that brine affect groundwater, made it unfit for use, public drinking water supplies, surface vegetation, property damage, resulting in lawsuits, and damage to fish life followed when brine polluted streams. So this was all there in the 1950s. And I think, again, this is so significant. I'll get to it in just a moment, but practices developed in Pennsylvania, many different ways in which brine would make its way into the public waterways. And yet we have a very good record going back decades to show that brine contaminates public waterways when it gets into them. We can go to the next slide. And I think that language, by the way, on the last slide is really appropriate. Brine is the Achilles heel of the industry. It's really a major problem for them that they've never figured out a good way to deal with it. This is extraordinary, the amount of brine produced across the country. So if you took all the brine produced in the US each year, which is over 1 trillion gallons, and you put that into standard barrels, oil field barrel is like maybe waist high, and you stack those barrels up on top of each other, you would reach the moon and back almost 28 times. That's an extraordinary waste stream. And we can go to the next slide, that the industry has never had a good idea, a good solution for how to deal with. Focusing on the radium, it's important to ask, well, you're saying it's radioactive, Justin, how radioactive? What do those numbers really mean? Radium is a really worrisome radioactive element. The EPA has limits, and those limits are pretty conservative. They're quite strict. So the unit here is picocuries per liter. EPA has set a safe drinking water limit at 5, and that's combining radium-226 and 228. And then for each of those, these are the different forms or isotopes of radium that are most worrisome in brine. For each of those forms, at 60, you reach a level where EPA actually defines a liquid waste stream as radioactive, and then we can see the levels in the Marcellus, 8,344. That's the average level for radium-226. And again, 60 is the level where we're defining radioactive. That is EPA, well before fracking ever came about. They set these definitions, and here we are, average level, hundreds of times above that in the Marcellus. And when you combine the two forms, we have a average in the Marcellus that's not listed here of about 9,330 picocuries per liter, and a high recorded of 28,500. And again, you can see 5 is the safe drinking water limit. So we're well above that. And we're also well above this threshold where EPA is defined. What is radioactive? Well, there it is. And we're higher. And we can go to the next slide. Um, and these are some levels across the country. Marcellus happens to have the highest recorded levels in the nation when it comes to radium levels in the oil field brine. And we can go to the next slide. And so I want to focus on these two places, particularly for southwestern Pennsylvania. And I know there's folks beyond, but the whole Marcellus Utica area, two of the big problems with waste are injection wells and oil field waste treatment plants. And so here we'll focus on injection wells. So where does all the brine go? This extraordinary waste stream, most of it goes to injection wells. Pennsylvania does not have as many as neighboring states, but Pennsylvania is regularly trying to permit injection wells. They're trying to fix that, and of course, communities appropriately are fighting that. But this is just to show you how problematic the idea of injection is. For one, you're going to be putting the waste into trucks. The trucks are not placarded, as we just discussed. They don't have any symboling on them to indicate that they contain a hazardous waste stream, a toxic waste stream, a radioactive waste stream. Here is a truck going through downtown Barnesville, Ohio. They're regularly going through community settings. And then here we have an injection well that's located on the edge of a shopping mall in Cambridge, Ohio. And again, as I've said many times, you can sit in a restaurant like Taco Bell and eat and watch trucks unload this waste. Now, what the book lays out, not only have injection wells been poorly cited, but they are leaking across the country. And the reason they are leaking is because, and this is really one of the most important takeaways of the book, and I'm really excited to put these documents out to the public, but there is no scientific doctrine. There's no scientific theory that backs up injection wells. And this is pretty amazing to think. I mean, this is a formal program. It's regulated by EPA under the Underground Injection Control Program. There is no science behind it. From the first time I started reporting on oil field waste, 2017, I asked a series of questions to regulators. And they go something like this. How do you know the waste is going to be contained in the layer that you're injecting? Do you have some sort of way to determine the waste is leaking out? They do have some attempt to try and do that. And when do you think the layer that you're injecting into is filled? I mean, is it going to be filled in a year, in 10 years, in 1,000 years? They have no answers for these questions. And now after doing the work, I've realized it's because there really are no answers. So what the book lays out is there were industry conferences where the industry met with some of the best hydrologists in the country. This happened in the early 1970s, and they laid out their concerns about the process of injection. Injection was not as big of the practice was not as popular at that point, but it was gaining in popularity, and the scientists were deeply worried. And they laid out this kind of prediction for the future of what would happen if this practice were to continue. Now, they never would have dreamed it would have continued at the pace it has. I mean, it's really metastasized in just an extraordinary way, in a really concerning way. But even at the pace it was going in the early 1970s, they laid out what was going to happen. Earthquakes, which are already happening, but also that the waste would leak out. And I can get into more details on that of just why it's impossible to contain waste in the way they're trying to do. But that's something that I think is going to be really important. And the book has really powerful documents. Again, these are industry and government documents, which really just take the veil off this scientific process. That's not a scientific process. You can't just shove endless barrels of fracking waste underground willy-nilly and think it's going to, stay under Taco Bell. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So moving past the brine, we get to this other really important problem for the industry, which is if you hold brine in a tank or a truck, if you contain it in any sort of vessel for any amount of time, really, the solid particles in it are going to start to settle out. Brine is really gunky. It has a lot of suspended solid particles. Think of like a stream on a kind of turbid stream that has a lot of stuff floating in it. Sometimes brine can seem quite clear, but even when it's clear, that really hides the fact that there is a lot contained in it. There's a lot of different metals often in it, and again, the salt. So what happens to this stuff? It settles out at the bottom, just like if you leave your coffee cup for long enough, there'll be a little layer of sludge at the bottom. Similar thing happens in a brine truck or a brine tank. So using these yellow highlights to show that in a brine truck, you'd have this sludge accumulated at the bottom. And here you have on the right brine tanks at a wellhead that's in Weld County, Colorado, monster wellhead. And there's going to be sludge accumulating. That's going to be a job that falls to workers who are often, and in most cases, from my reporting, not going to be properly informed of the contents of that sludge. And that's also going to have to go somewhere. And this really becomes a major liability for the industry and something that they've been able to deceive people on for quite some time. But I think we're starting to break away that deception by providing this knowledge. We can go to the next slide. This is just to touch on, I think what's important to pay attention to is the economic element. You figure we have this multi-billion dollar industry in the oil and gas industry. They have a problem, which is the waste. And of course, what happens with that becomes, kind of goes through the capitalist system. So there is a massive incentive to get rid of the waste, which means you have investors now very excited about focusing on this part of the industry. All sorts of money has flowed in to try and solve the oil field waste problem. Unfortunately, because of, in some cases, because of the exemptions the industry has, they've never really been pushed to truly solve it. So these attempts to solve it have been half attempts, and they led to all sorts of problems. But still, I think it's really important to be wary that you have a huge demand, a huge kind of market push for these investments. And if people have investments, say in different pension funds or in things where they're not necessarily looking at every single investment, you may well have money invested in trying to treat oil field waste and not even know it. And even though that sounds good, investing in trying to treat oil field waste, that typically ends up meaning contaminating workers and contaminating a community. And we can go to the next slide. And I think, in this slide, we see exactly what happened. So these are two different projects. And they're fracking waste treatment projects. So what's happening here is two very different types of companies said, we're going to take the brine and we're going to clean it. We're going to take out the salts, and we might even use the salts as a commercial product, and we're going to give the water back to the industry so they can frack new wells. And it's a great environmental project. Excuse me. What they often do not highlight is how are they going to remove the radioactivity? How are they going to remove the radium, which, as we just learned, can be quite elevated in Marcellus brine? And so what regularly happens in the projects that I followed is, again, a lot of gusto, a lot of money coming in. People are very excited to invest in them. The project on the left was put together by Intero Resources and Veolia, which is a multi-billion-dollar company based in Paris, France. Project on the right was put together by Fairmont Brine, which is a company based in Pittsburgh, actually. So the one on the left, a lot savvier capital coming in, but they both ended up not working after just a couple years. And we can go to the next slide. Something that happened, which was really unexpected, is I actually got access to that site on the right, to the Fairmont Brine site. And so this is where we really get to learn, what does it look like at these plants and what do they leave behind? What do they leave behind for communities? And it's really an absolute disaster. So I'm going around here with Jill Hunkler, a really great organizer in the Ohio River Valley area, and Dr. Yuri Gorby, former Department of Energy scientist, now really an important scientist who goes around with different organizing groups and kind of helps them crack environmental problems. And because this site was completely unfenced off, there's no trespassing signs, at least at the time we visited, we're able to go right in and see what an abandoned fracking waste treatment plant looked like. And Yuri is there with a Geiger counter. And this Geiger counter, he had set an alarm at 2 milliroentgens per hour, which is an OSHA limit and also a limit of great concern. If you're around those levels, you want to get away immediately, or at least have very appropriate PPE. We had some PPE, but not enough even to deal with those levels. That's a really high level. So as Geiger counter issued this alarm, it maxed out. Those levels, by the way, are higher than 99% of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. This is an area around Chernobyl that we've fenced off. Of course, the reactor itself, much, much, much higher levels, but the reactor contaminated the land, and that land is so contaminated that people have decided it's now unlivable and set an exclusion zone. And yet here you can walk right into it in northern West Virginia, where the site is. And people were walking right into it. You can see the graffiti, you can see the busted up furniture. This place became, unfortunately, a teenage hangout spot. And now finally the EPA, after I published a series of articles and some really great community action on this issue, the EPA is moving towards turning it into a Superfund site. But I mean, 10 minutes before they did that, kids were hanging out in a radioactive Superfund site. You can expect some version of this at every single one of these fracking waste treatment plants, because no one that I have seen, and if there's industry listening and wants to show me they can do it differently, I'll come visit you tomorrow, but no one I've seen has been able to appropriately treat this, including the previous project, which was a $255 million plant. That's a lot of money to spend trying to treat fracking waste. They still were not able to do it successfully. I just learned today, and this is, I think, a really important bit of a nice chance for organizers in Ohio to pat themselves on the back. I just learned that the Attorney General in Ohio has brought an investigation against Austin Master, which is a really worrisome fracking waste treatment plant in right along the Ohio River in Martins Ferry, Ohio. Now, what's worrisome about that facility, and I have a whole chapter dedicated to this in the book, is that this facility, they're doing something a little bit different than these other plants. They're taking in the solid waste, so not the brine so much, but the sludge that settles out of the brine, which can have a much, much more high radioactive signature than the brine. They're taking the radioactive drill cuttings that are too radioactive to take to local landfills, and they're doing a completely absurd process called downblending, where they're mixing that radioactive material with lesser non-radioactive material, trying to lower the levels so they can then get it to a local landfill. I mean, it's really, it's like teenagers or something came up with this idea at a bar. It's crazy, but that is what's happening. It's a disaster. I've spoken to many workers from that facility, all sorts of, terrible worker practices. It's really the workers who are most at risk of this facility. But I want to mention it because I learned the landfills that facility is taking their supposedly lower level waste to, and many of those landfills are actually in Pennsylvania. And I can drum that list up when we get to the questions. But one of them is the landfill in Belle Vernon, the Westmoreland Sanitary Landfill. So this is this is waste that they say we've lowered the levels. It's appropriate to go to a local landfill. It may or may not be. Me knowing how difficult this industry. How difficult it's been for this industry to treat its waste appropriately and transport it appropriately, I have a lot of questions about those waste streams. And so in my book, anyone taking waste from Austin Master really needs to be alarmed and needs to do a really close level of due diligence to make sure that waste is indeed not radioactive, because the facility has not been handled in an appropriate manner. And we can go to the next slide. And these are, here we go, some photos from Austin Master, and you can see the upper one is Austin Master, the right is Austin Master. I mean, this, does this look like the product of the most sophisticated, expensive, richest industry on earth? No. And really what they have is an old steel mill, and they pile the waste on the floor, and the ceiling has been regularly leaking for many years. They may have fixed that now, I'm not sure, but you can see tire tracks. In other photos, there's tire tracks leading the waste right out of the building. And we found that levels of radioactivity increase in the public road as you get closer to this facility. So I am very happy to hear that the AG in Ohio is looking into it. I think the concern, though, is we have many other facilities just like this in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, that aren't operating so differently, and who is looking into them, and if this one gets shut down, this waste is just going to end up at another facility that I still would question, their operating practices. But it is good people are paying attention now to these facilities. They're often in communities and people are completely unaware. We can go to the next slide. Another issue is the transformation of oil field waste into consumer products. And again, it seems like something from a science fiction movie, but industry is really desirous of exactly this. If you can turn a waste stream into a product, it's not a waste stream. It doesn't have to be regulated, and you can now sell it. It's a genius marketing move. And so that's what they've done in many cases. This product, at least at one point, was being sold at hardware stores in Ohio. It was being sold at Lowe's. It was the Ohio Department of Natural Resources themselves, to give them credit, who went in and tested it. And they found radium levels that, again, you can see listed there in point number 2, well higher than the limits that have been set to define, thresholds, well above this limit of what would be called radioactive, and of course well above the safe drinking water limit. Now, you're not going to be drinking it, but you are going to be pouring it on your driveway and sidewalk, and walking on it, and your pet's going to be walking on it. And there's recently been some good academic research to point out just how concerning this practice is of dumping radioactive oil field waste onto your sidewalk to try and melt snow and ice. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so I'll go through this. People may or may not be aware of this exemption, and then I think there's a lot more I could talk about, but I want to open it up for some questions. But this exemption is extraordinary. This is the Benson and Bevel amendments to the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act is attempting to deal with the U.S.'s industrial hazardous waste problem in the late 1970s. And so and the way to deal with that, which was good, we're going to define waste as either hazardous or non-hazardous. Hazardous waste has to be treated in a more secure manner. Non-hazardous has less stringent regulations. And the oil and gas industry was able to get all of their waste defined as non-hazardous. And I just want to point out what that means. That means we have scale accumulating in pipelines, actually, that have a significant radioactive signature. They can have the radioactive element polonium at 1 million picocuries per gram, which is like 1 million times background. It's a very high level. That waste, because of this exemption, would be called non-hazardous. And I want to show you one slide because I want to show an important ramification. So maybe go one slide next. We might have to skip around a little bit. Go one more slide. Yes. So because oil field waste is, by the letter of U.S. law, non-hazardous, I learned that it can actually be imported, and it has been imported from foreign oil fields into the U.S. And it goes to this site right here called Lotus in West Texas. They have a legitimate permits to inject the waste into what's called the salt cavern. So they're supposed to they're supposed to grind the waste up in this slurification process and inject it down a hole into a salt cavern. Now, a salt cavern is as close as we can get to an underground storage locker on Earth, and has been deemed by the Department of Energy as an appropriate place to contain radioactive oil field waste. The problem is there's a lot happening, and in the record of Lotus, to indicate that they've had significant trouble trying to grind the radioactive waste up, and actually inject it down a hole into the salt cavern. And so what this picture appears to show is stockpiled radioactive waste on the site. And the records of Lotus that I obtained via records request from the Railroad Commission also indicate historically that the facility has had a problem with doing this task of grinding the waste up and injecting it down. So this, to me, is a really kind of sorry emblem of where the U.S. oil and gas industry is. I mean, you see like the fancy commercials and it all looks like they're handling everything appropriately, but this is really the graveyard. This facility has accepted radioactive oil field waste from virtually every single operator that I know of, at least in the oil field. I mean, they've taken waste from Alaska, from Michigan, even from non-oil and gas states like Iowa, but that still have radioactive sludge and scale building up in pipelines. And then I found out via conversations with the officials themselves, for a while they were quite cooperative with my reporting, that they've accepted radioactive oil field waste from other countries. And I think it really shows the paltry nature of our regulations once you actually dig into this. I can talk a little bit about the downstream issues as well, because they're important radioactive emissions issues with pipelines, with compressor stations, with cracker plants. But maybe I just want to see if there's any questions at this point. I know it's quite a lot of material.
Yeah, it was a lot. Thank you so much for that, Justin. And I just want to mention a couple things. And we do have some interest in the chat. Someone, Lynn says that, hello, Justin, thanks so much for this talk. Can you tell us about your thoughts for raising awareness to this issue of oil and gas waste? And I also have some thoughts on that. So go ahead, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think I'll just use the group that I been working a lot with in Ohio as a great example. There's a couple groups in that area. Jill Hunkler is part of Ohio River Allies. That's her group. And then there's also a group called CORE, Concerned Ohio River Residents. But what they've done is they spotlighted this problem in their community. There is a fracking waste treatment plant in their community. No one knew it was a fracking waste treatment plant. They've defined it as what it is. They've tried to bring attention to their local town officials, who often were some of the most resistant people in hearing about it. They've told the local media about it. They're working with a really fantastic, recently retired firefighter who's a hazmat and radioactivity expert to raise awareness and understand what's really happening here and what does this mean for the community and what are they not doing appropriately. They've really done a lot to raise awareness. And then they've done things that give journalists like me a chance to write about it, which is, for one, those photos exist because some great Ohio organizers pressed the state in releasing their inspection reports. That's a records request, and you can get that. It turns out the state was regularly visiting the site, and there was a lot of important information. And then they went one step further, and they actually, conducted their own scientific study by trying to sample and by sampling near the facility. So I think and now there's major action. I mean, the EPA previously was investigating, and now you have an attorney general investigating, and now you have a lot of awareness. I think it's a lot harder for the people in that community to say this isn't a problem when their own state attorney general, who it's a conservative government right now in Ohio, they're investigating this. So I say the lesson would be, learn what's happening, really try and wrap your head around the science and the process of it. And if you can't, now there's some really good groups and people who know and can help you. So if you have an issue and you don't know so well about it, you can reach out to one of the groups I just mentioned. There's also Mountain Watershed in Pennsylvania. There's Center for Coalfield Justice, very good groups with a lot of knowledge on these topics. And then you can, take it to town meetings, take it to local meetings, take it to your local representatives. And you can also do what they did if you have a chance to actually do on the ground science, whether it's testing along a public road or testing at an outfall where a facility that you're worried about is discharging to a stream. Those are all things that, people can do and have been done. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, Lynn, if you go ahead and email me after this, I can connect you with Tom, who here at Protect BT, we actually work with a lot of these organizations, not only here in Pennsylvania, but also in Ohio and West Virginia. And we actually have developed some shared resources that we're happy to share with you. And we can talk a little bit more about how to do that organizing, because I think, what Justin was talking about, identifying the locations, and I think that's kind of like the first step that we talk about when we talk about, just really being aware of what's around you is step one. And then step two is, how do you tell other people about what's around you, right? And so we've got some great organizing tools to help folks do that. So yeah, definitely reach out to me. I'm going to go ahead and put my email in the chat, and I'm happy to share those details with you, because we're often in communication with many of the groups that Justin talked about, and we actually meet monthly with these folks from Ohio and West Virginia, and we're happy to connect you. And then Lynn also has another question, but she asked if you could explain the title of your book.
Yeah. Thank you, Lynn. So you're asking good questions. So definitely check the book out. I'm so happy for people to be able to see what I've been working on for the past 7 years. But the title is a play off uranium-238. Uranium-238 is a radioactive form of uranium. Uranium is a radioactive element that's natural in Earth's soil and rocks and crust. And it's one of the elements, what we would say at the top of the decay chain. So a radioactive element is radioactive because it's unstable. And at some point in time, it's going to shoot off a little piece of itself. It's going to fire off part of itself. And that's what we call radiation. You don't want to be near it when that happens. And after it's lost that piece of itself, it literally becomes another element, right? Because it's lost an important component. Uranium-238 is what's starting. Uranium-238 is almost stable. It has a half-life of about 4.5 billion years. So that means for uranium-238, roughly every 4.5 billion years, it's going to shoot off a little piece of itself and then become another element. Other radioactive elements have half-lives that are more on the order of like minutes or seconds. But uranium-238 is an important one because its half-life is so long. It doesn't go away very quickly on geologic time. So there's uranium-238 that's been around literally since the beginning of time, and it's still there, collected in the rocks of Earth. And when oil and gas is brought to the surface, uranium-238 is brought up in the drill cuttings, and it's also going through its decay chain down in the formation and yielding other elements like radium, which end up coming up in the produced water. So it's kind of the beginning step of the radioactive chain. And petroleum is just a nice way to point out that it's radioactive. Oil and gas is radioactive. The grassroots fight to stop it is you all.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. And we have another question in the chat from Fabiana. She writes, "Are salts still being produced from fracking waste?" And I have a little bit of information on this, but Justin, I want to hear from you first.
Yeah, you might know more than me, Jillian. There's a great investigative journalism outlet called Public Herald that's looked into that exact situation, and I haven't followed up with that, so I don't necessarily have the answer.
Yeah, actually, so we had a lunch and learn, I think last year, about this with Dr. John Stoles from Duquesne University, as well as Teresa Mills, who has recently passed, unfortunately. Wonderful, amazing organizer. Taught me so much about oil and gas waste. She was also slated to be on that particular lunch and learn and couldn't actually make it that day, but she had been working with John on this issue. And the last that I heard, and actually Buckeye Environmental might have more information on this, but the last that I heard, the Ohio Department of Health deemed that this was not a good idea and stopped the process of making pool salts a commodity, which is what they were trying to do. Basically, what Justin was describing with like selling it in lows, they're trying to make it a commodity so it can be. Yeah, so Teresa and others worked to stop that process, and I was told that they were successful. I haven't heard anything probably for 6 to 9 months, but that was the last thing that I heard about it. And so, yeah, the folks at Buckeye Environmental were leading the charge on that, and so they might have more updated information on that. But yeah, go ahead, Justin.
No, I really appreciate that reply. Although I don't, if the question was referring to pool salts,
Mm-hmm.
there was a company in Pennsylvania that was making pool salts,
Hmm.
and that I don't have the answer to. If the question was referring to the Aqua Salina product that Jillian was just talking about, they just like Jillian said, they were able to get the Ohio Department of Transportation to stop using that product on public roads, but towns and municipalities are still able to order it. And this is often the problem because for small towns, one of your biggest expenses in the north is snow and ice removal and dust control, right? And so they still can order it. So it still is being used across Ohio. And another concern is because de-icing products are not being tested for radium and don't necessarily have to show their source, we don't know how many radioactive de-icers are out there. Although Aqua Salina is certainly a case a unique case in a way, but I don't know. I can't say firmly whether there are or aren't other companies like that trying to do the exact same thing.
Yeah, Justin, I'd be interested in knowing like who in Pennsylvania was dealing with the pool salts. But I think it's interesting, like the aqua salina, it says kills ice, and I'm just wondering if they should put disclaimers of what else it kills on there, because that seems
Yeah,
pretty crazy. And when I heard about this from Teresa, I was just really shocked that this was happening. I didn't know about it until she approached me about it. I want to kind of go back a little bit to the injection wells because I don't know how if you've done any reporting on this, but so you had mentioned that in Pennsylvania, we have fewer injection wells, and actually, what we're seeing is the uptick in injection wells here in Pennsylvania. And there's a couple issues that we've seen, and I just want to get your comment, your reaction or comments on this. So one, we've seen that injection wells are being are in Pennsylvania are being made by transforming conventional wells into injection wells. So we see that a lot happening. We've seen it in Plum, Pennsylvania. We actually have a meeting tonight in Plum with the residents that live around that well. We've seen it in upper northern Pennsylvania, in small towns. We actually have seen it, and Fayette County just actually wrote an amazing ordinance that really prohibits or adds protections to injection wells. We saw that happening there, as well as other towns in PA. So, with regard to just like the oil and gas industry's attempts to try to get rid of this waste, how do you view the opportunity that they see with using conventional wells and repurposing them for injection wells? How do you view that as problematic in this space?
yeah, no, good question, Jillian. Thank you. So it's a cheap way to do it, right? You already have a well drilled, um, and if you think about that first slide I showed, where is oil and gas going to accumulate in the earth? It's going to collect. It's the black shale is the mother lode, the source, but as it seeps out, where is it going to collect? It's going to collect in layers that are porous, that have a lot of little, has space between the grains. A porous layer could be like a sandstone layer, whereas other layers, like shales, are not porous. So layers with a lot of porosity are going to that's where you're going to collect. That's where you would have groundwater. That's where you would have oil and gas. If you drain that layer, you take out the oil and gas, you now have so to speak, an empty porous layer. And so the industry has determined that these are the best layers to put waste back in. And they'll use this language like, we're just, quote, putting it back where it came from. Well, the problem with that is, for one, oil and gas is naturally seeping out all across the country. In Pennsylvania, you have salt springs and different streams where you have gas flows. This is natural. So these layers are filled with cracks. Even before you start doing the very invasive process of oil and gas development. Modern fracking, what I call modern fracking, although it's not very modern, that's a newer development, but people have been fracking for decades, which means they're kind of blasting apart these layers to try and get the oil and gas out. So any layer that's been developed for oil and gas, it's going to have natural cracks, and then it's going to have been through this really unknown process of humans fracturing it apart to make the oil and gas more accessible. So to think that we can now put waste back into those layers and somehow they're appropriate, no, that the science doesn't hold there. But the other problem is really fundamental, which is that these layers do not contain waste. What they do is they contain it for long enough that we don't necessarily pay attention when they start leaking. And so you imagine like a well and the waste being injected, and it's forming like a little bulb of waste underground, and that's under pressure, and it's as it slowly pushes stuff out of the way, it's actually initially pushing water out of the way, and this is what's laid out in some of these documents I mentioned in the book. So if you have a water well, say like 6 miles away from an injection well, you might first notice at some point that your well has an increased flow of fresh water. There's more pressure. And that's because the waste is pushing the fresh water underground out of the way and pushing it up into your water well. So it's people might think like, wow, this is a great thing. Well, no, no, no. What comes next is the waste itself. And right now in Ohio, there are 3 different cases where injection wells are leaking. Now, where are they leaking? They're leaking into other places where there's holes in the ground. So they're leaking into conventional gas wells. So another problem of putting fracking waste down a gas well is because typically these are areas where there's a lot of gas wells. So you're shoving waste into a area that's pinpricked with all these different wells, and so you have a ready-made opportunity for that waste to come back up at the surface. And that's exactly what is happening in Ohio. This waste, and this is a very important issue because you have conventional gas operators and they have a product. They're bringing conventional gas to the surface. They're supplying homes and schools with that. And their gas has been ruined now because of fracking waste. So the precedent has already been set for contamination.
Yeah, yeah, and actually we see that now conventional well operators in Ohio are opposing new injection wells, which is very interesting. And so it does seem like, when you had said that that this waste is the Achilles heel of the industry, it definitely seems like it is, because even folks within the industry are saying this is not a safe practice. So I think that is a big red flag for folks in Ohio and here in Pennsylvania and West Virginia as well. I did not know that. So the Austin Masters facility, I knew a lot. I know a lot about that because I'm in touch with the folks that are working around that. I know also that many of our like filter socks and stuff here from Pennsylvania, all of that other debris and stuff that they take off the well pad when it's done with production or when it's done with the fracking part, they'll actually send that to Austin Masters. But I didn't know that Austin Masters was basically like kind of diluting that material, so to speak. I don't know how much you can dilute it, but dilute it enough so it can then go back to Westmoreland County,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
back
No,
to
let me tell you what they're doing, Jillian. It's again,
crazy.
it's like someone's writing a horror script. What they're doing with the filter socks is they put it. I mean, you've seen. I imagine many people have seen Fargo. There's a famous scene, I think, where Steve Buscemi gets put through the wood chipper. They're putting radioactive filter socks through a wood chipper.
Oh my gosh.
That's how they treat them.
Oh my gosh.
So they're grinding them up into pieces and then mixing them up with other stuff. If it's too radioactive, they have to send it to a site in
Mm-hmm.
Utah, in the Utah desert, or in West Texas. If they can get the levels low enough, then they can send it to a regular landfill. But I mean, that's the level of science. They're grinding radioactive filter socks up in a
Wow.
wood chipper. One of the wood chippers they used at one point was called the Muffin Monster. This is referred to in the Ohio inspection reports. I mean, I don't know how regulators can look at that, which they did, and say, yeah, everything's okay here, and check that box and move on.
Wow. Wow.
It's
That's
very
amazing. Yeah, yeah, and I was told by folks that were at that site that when researchers went to go look at the site, they found that the radioactivity just from their boots was very, very high, which is kind of crazy. All right, so it
yeah.
looks like there were some great comments. Kiara had put in the chat. Thank you for that, Kiara. And yeah, so there are folks that definitely wanted to get as much time with you as possible talking about this subject itself. And so just wanted to find out what else, because I don't see any more questions really quickly in the chat. Let's maybe move on to some other subjects that you want to cover in the time that we have left, because we do have a couple more minutes. Are there other things that you want to talk about or touch upon before we move on today?
Yeah, so let's go through a couple, just go slowly through the slides, and I will tell you when to stop. Um, So this is landfills. This is featuring Public Herald's work. Really great reporting on the landfill issue, but we can go to the next slide. Oklahoma. They spread drilling waste on cropland. Um, we can go to the next slide. This is what a worker looks like after cleaning out sludge. And unfortunately, you see very poor level of protection. It's really astonishing. These clothes could be brought home or brought to the hotel washing machine. We can go to the next slide. And maybe keep going. This is some important research from, keep going. And I'm just trying to get to something. One more slide, maybe, or maybe two more, one more. Perfect. Okay. How much time do we have left, Jillian? Okay. I'm reading your lips since it was mute, but that's perfect. Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, just go right ahead.
Okay, yeah. So this is another really interesting pathway. Scientifically, it's fascinating that radioactivity accumulates and is concentrated in oil field waste. The industry's processes further concentrate it. So it's there in the brine, the sludge, the drill cuttings. It's also there in the product itself, and this leads to a lot of problems that we didn't discuss yet. So I'll just briefly touch on this pathway. It's really important one for Pennsylvania. And actually, let's go back one slide or maybe two slides. I want to show you this paper. Yeah, right there. Yeah, that one. So forward one. Perfect. Radioactive gas from crude petroleum. 1904. This was a graduate student at the University of Toronto. So anyone can do this research. You don't need to have a billion-dollar lab. A very simple and interesting way. They collected crude oil at the wellhead, and they realized that there was a radioactive gas inherent in that crude oil. At this point, they didn't even know the name of that element, but we now know this to be radon. So they found that in 1904. I mean, you'd think if we had a product they were all using and they knew it was radioactive, they would have studied it a little bit more. Now we can go forward back to the little diagram that I had drawn. So we have radon in natural gas. What does that mean? That means radon is going to go through the natural gas system, and because natural gas is compressed and so much natural gas gets shoved into a pipeline, the levels can become quite high. And so the places of concern end up being filters and pumps and valves within the system. These are places that move the product and flow changes. And that's because in those places, just imagine your kitchen sink. Where does stuff get gunked up in the pipes? It's places where flow or pressure changes, where there's bends in the pipe, where we have little filters or valves, right? Same thing in the natural gas pipeline system. And what's happening here is the radon, which is a gas, it's happily flowing through with the natural gas. But radon is a radioactive element. So it shoots off its radiation. It's inside the pipeline. No one's really been harmed there. Shoots off its radiation, but it's now become a different element. Radon is a gas, and it's a gas that it's called a noble gas. It doesn't really like to form bonds. It doesn't tend to form bonds with other elements. As soon as radon shoots off its radiation and decays, it becomes a form of polonium. Polonium is a metal, and it's very reactive, which means it very quickly forms bonds. So it forms a bond with a little particle in the gas stream, and it will often end up then sticking either to the side of the pipeline or it gets stuck at these places of flow or pressure change, like a pump or a valve. So we have this first problem of radioactive sludge and scale accumulating in the pipeline system. The industry will clean this via a process that's called pigging. And the workers will run this robotic cleaning mole through the pipeline, and it comes up, and wherever it comes up is a place of concern, potentially, because it comes up filled with all the radioactive gunk it just cleaned off the inside of the pipeline. And then workers will, by hand, clean that radioactive waste from there and put it into at least in the instance with the worker I spoke to, it's put more appropriately than other waste into a barrel, and those barrels are taken to the desert in West Texas, to the place I showed you that photo of. But still, I think that process is really concerning. If you have a pig launching point in your community, that means a place where the pipeline is going to be accessed and cleaned out, which means they will, even though they're not telling you this, they will be cleaning the radioactive waste out of the pipeline, and those levels can get really high. And the other important place of concern following that pathway is places of emissions. So, for example, a compressor station, we have all sorts of emissions. A lot of the contaminants, and there are many contaminants in natural gas, they will be just vented to the atmosphere. And I mean, talk to people who live near compressor stations, and they can tell you just how horrendous those emissions are. Companies have legal permits that allow them to discharge tens of thousands of pounds of carcinogens. A lot of worry about contaminants like benzene, but you will also be expected to have radon and then the daughter products of radon, different isotopes of polonium and lead in those emissions as well. The benzene and the other elements are so concerning that often takes a priority, but you still have this realization that you have radioactivity that would be released at a compressor station. Now, this is something that if you follow the industry reports, it's laid out there. And we're just now, and I'm trying to encourage researchers to look at this, but we're just now starting to test those emissions and find ways to test downstream of compressor stations and natural gas power plants and natural gas processing plants and see just how radioactive they are. But this is an entirely different pathway. A cracker plant too, by the way. So if you figure pumps and valves are concerned, a major whistleblower in the book is someone who cleaned pumps and valves from cracker plants. A cracker plant is really just miles of tubes and tanks where fluids are going to be changed to gases and back and forth again. The state of matter is being regularly changed. So to do that, you need hundreds, if not thousands of pumps and valves, and they can accumulate a radioactive scale and sludge that has to be cleaned. And so that too becomes a really significant worker risk, and until now, a really invisible one as well.
Wow. When you were just talking, I was having deja vu because when you were talking about the compressor stations, I was like transported back to a couple weeks ago when we had a compressor station hearing in our community where they're trying to put a new compressor station. And our expert actually talked about some of the exact same process that you were talking about. And like, it didn't really, I guess at the time, because it was a hearing, dawn on me but until you said it, and I was like, oh my gosh, yes, this is, and so these pigging stations, this compressor station, we're going to have these emissions in our community. And we also have the drilling in our community. So it's like ground zero for oil and gas waste and radioactivity, because we get it coming up from the wellhead, we get it transported to trucks. We also have a landfill that's accepting the fracking waste. Then we have a compressor station that's compressing the gas and filling up tanks of different sludges and stuff. And it's just like, where do we go from here? It's just really crazy to think about. All of the different things that we're now going to be exposed to thanks to this industry coming into our community. And so I just want to, tell folks, like, if you did not attend the last compressor station hearing, you definitely should. And then also I put a question on the screen. I'm so sorry. I missed this in the chat earlier. Just want to mention that, so someone had a question, is this the Westmoreland Sanitary Landfill mentioned in your book? And assuming that, could that page be shown? Or could a person be sued by the industry for doing that? I'm not sure exactly you want to answer that, Justin.
Yeah. The landfill is mentioned in the book. But what the second part of the question, could a person be sued by the industry just for showing the book, or if the person is still there, they can clarify it?
Yeah, maybe you could clarify a little bit the last part of your question. And while you're doing that, I want to go on to, there's another question in the chat. Does the DEP do any air monitoring on compressor stations, like the one next to the YMCA in Plum, where our meeting is tonight? So yeah, just that is another question. Does the DEP do any air monitoring at compressor stations? I don't believe they do. Do you know answer that question, Justin?
I'm not aware that they're testing for radioactivity. That I do not believe they're doing. Are they testing for other contaminants? I'm not sure. They do grant permits that again, legally enable companies to discharge other other contaminants like benzene. So I imagine there must be some testing that enables them to be led to that permit. But there's certainly, as far as I know, not testing for radioactivity, because that would be a really important, that would give us really important data. And I haven't seen that data. So I don't believe they're testing on that issue.
Yeah, the last that I heard, it's basically self-reported information for a compressor station. They have what's called a Title V permit, and that is self-reported. So it would really be up to, local organizations or people, individuals to test that. Okay, we do have some clarification here. Using a page from the book, copying it and sharing it on behalf of challenging it. Um, I'm not
Okay, I
sure.
think I get yeah, no, I get the gist of that. Yeah, I think, this is what the book is there for. The book is 330 pages, and the last 70 pages are references. So the book is there as a very well fact-checked guide to read and enjoy as a book, or to take to a meeting and hold up and say, here is a harm. And the book, has been vetted. So every industry, every company that's mentioned, I asked them questions. They either answered or didn't answer. Their answers are there, or the fact that they didn't answer in there. And yes, it is definitely something you can hold up, you can show around, and you don't have to fear that you are showing something that's, that hasn't been carefully examined. That's why it took me 7 years. So if that's the nature of the question, then yeah, that's the answer. Can I share it right now? I'm not sure I can show it right now, just because it's at this point it's coming out soon, and I've really got to try and contain, at least, I'm presenting what I can, but the actual pages of the book I don't think it'd be appropriate to show at this point. But in a month, you'll have access to all of them.
Nice, yeah. And okay, so before we go to, we have a couple slides of our own to share before we go to that. Are there any other slides that you think are super important for us to share with folks today, Justin, before we move on to a couple last minute items and hop off here today?
No, we covered a lot of ground. So
Yeah.
thank you all so much. Great questions, and thank you for your attention.
Yeah, for sure. And just to let folks know, definitely Justin's book is coming out here very soon, mid-April, April 24th. Definitely get a copy of it. There are some local folks that will have, I think you said what, White Whale in Pittsburgh will have it. That's a local bookstore, or you can use the QR code that Justin posted on the second slide. And we actually are planning also a book discussion event. So please get the book in advance, start reading it, and then we're planning something for June. We're still waiting to finalize details with our partner there, but once we are ready to go, we'll be publishing that on our website. So please look at protectbt.org/events for a follow-up event with Justin on that. Um, uh, they, La 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 Cha Cha says, thank you forever, Justin. And that's awesome. Just really quickly, I just want to mention thank you to folks for tuning in. Thank you to Justin for all of your amazing knowledge. You just packed so much great information into just a very small amount of time. We could really talk to you for hours on this subject for sure. And just want to mention for folks, we are going to be meeting back here on our Lunch and Learn on April 30th. That's our next Lunch and Learn, and we're going to be having Michelle Nakarati Chapkis we're going to be talking about Three Rivers 15 PFAS. So she is the executive director for Women for a Healthy Environment, and we're going to be talking about that, talking with her next month. And if you didn't have a chance, please take our survey. We want to find out if there are other subjects that folks want to talk about or learn about on our Lunch and Learn. And Justin, just want to thank you again for coming today. This was really tremendous, and we really appreciate all of your hard work on the book and really just the advocacy. Like, this is just another the more information we have, the better we can do advocacy for our community. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you all listening.
Awesome. Well, stay tuned for more stuff for with Justin coming up in June, and yeah, and get his book when it comes out in a couple weeks. Definitely get it. Start reading it, and yeah, we look forward to more discussions with you, Justin. And yeah, have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. I hope you enjoyed our lunch today, and thank you again, Justin. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Oh,
Bye.
thank you.